Hi everyone, welcome. I'm just going to give a couple minutes for folks to join and then we'll get started. All right, let's get rolling. So my name is Allie Bell and I am an LSAT instructor with Manhattan Prep. I have been for the past 10 years and I'm excited to be here with you all today. I wanted to start by getting to know a little bit about what brought you here. We typically have folks attend free prep hours who are kind of all over the spectrum in terms of study. So I'd imagine that some of you are preparing for the November LSAT Flex coming up in the next week and a half or so. And some of you may be preparing for a test that's further down the line, or even just dipping your toes into LSAT studying and seeing what it's all about. So I'm going to get the chat started and say hello to all of you. And you should see a little orange light blinking. If you're on a PC or if you're on a tablet or a phone, you can click the more button and it'll bring that up. And I'd love if you have a moment for you to just share your name, where you are joining us from in the world today, and what stage of your LSAT journey are you on? And so I'll pause for a moment to let you all introduce yourselves. Hi, Kayla. Hi, Natalie. That's very exciting. November 14th, only a few weeks away. Lindsay from Detroit also in the final stages. So is Nikita. Got a lot of November test takers. Great. Another New Yorker. Hi, Chelsea. Taking it in November. All right. We've got Kayla just getting started. That's great. A sage deer in the headlights. I love it, Deanna. I'd love to hear more about that. I imagine you're just getting started. All right. We've got a retaker. Some folks taking it in a year. All right, looks like we predominantly have folks who are taking it in November, but also some folks who've got some longer term plans. And I think tonight's lesson will be helpful to everybody, regardless of what stage of the journey that you're on. So I wanted to just start by sharing a few additional free prep options if you're looking for other ways to prepare for the LSAT. At Manhattan Prep, one of the services that we offer are live online courses. And you are able to sit in on the first session of any of our courses for free. It's a great learning opportunity. You get 3 hours of free instruction, primarily focused on logical reasoning and logic games in the hands of an expert instructor. We also have a tool called LSAT Interact, which is an adaptive video series that teaches you the same content that's in our course. And you're able to try that on our website for free if you'd like to. So if you're looking for more free LSAT resources, check out our website to learn more about those. Today, we are going to be focusing on logic games. And as we typically do in our courses, we're going to focus on one particular type of logic game that many folks find quite challenging and intimidating, and it's called in and out grouping. So hopefully for those of you who are preparing for the November test, this will be a great review of in and out grouping, as well as game recognition in general, and an opportunity to try a pretty difficult in and out grouping game. And for those of you who are just starting your LSAT prep, this will be an opportunity for you to start learning some of the strategies that we use for grouping games in particular. All right. So, and I see a longer chat in the chat box. It may take me a moment to get back to you if you have a more detailed question, but I'll catch up with you in just a minute when everybody's working on a game. So for logic games, the first thing I want to start with is just a little bit of context. For those of you who are coming up on your test day, it's going to be particularly important for you to be able to put together everything you've learned about logic games by recognizing the type of game that you're being given on test day. And one of the things that I recommend to students is that they have sort of a standard process, a series of questions or decisions that they make or attributes that they look for to help them decide what type of game is this and what type of diagram do I want to make. And I want to just start by sharing with y'all the way that I approach a logic game, which is the first question that I ask myself anytime I see a logic game is this asking me to put things in order? Is this asking me to put things into groups? Or is it asking me to do both? And I think that's a really important opening question because the vast majority of logic games can be divided into a few simple diagrams. And if I know that I have an ordering game, then there are really just two basic diagrams that come to mind. Same if I know I have a grouping game. Today we're going to tackle games that ask us to put things into groups, but not into order. And when I'm given one of those games, it's usually going to come in one of a few varieties. So sometimes they're going to give me a game that has multiple groups, so maybe more than two groups. And they're going to tell me exactly how many go in each group. Or I may need to figure out how many in each group. And for those, I'm typically going to use some variation of a grouping board. So I'm going to say, okay, here are maybe the three soccer teams, soccer team A, soccer team B, and soccer team C. And they're telling me there's going to be maybe three or more people on each team. So I create some spaces on that board. The other type of game that I might be given is one where there are exactly two groups. And I have a series of rules that are called conditional rules, which means that they kind of look like this. If A is selected, B is not. If C is not selected, D is not selected. So conditional rules are situations where I have an if-then relationship between two of the elements in my game. What happens to one of the elements is dependent on what happens to one of the other elements. And for in and out grouping, I'm typically going to have either an in group and an out group, or just two groups, and the elements are going to be placed within those groups based on a series of conditional rules. Once I recognize that I've got a two group game and I notice that there are mostly conditional rules, then I want to start using what we call the logic chain. And this is a diagram that I want everyone to come away feeling comfortable that they have a starting place with today. So let's dive into that. So the logic chain, just to recap, is a tool that you want to use when there are exactly two groups. And that's typically going to come in the form of an in and out game, or you could think of it as a game in which some elements are selected and some are not. Typically, all or almost all of the rules in a game like this are going to be conditional. And there typically won't be a lot of twists except for two that we're actually going to see in the game that we do today, which are subgroups and special positions. Subgroups are when we have, let's say, a bunch of animals in the zoo and we're deciding which ones are on display and which ones are not. And they're grouped into different species like monkeys and pandas. And special positions is when we have kind of like a starred position for one or more particular element. Like we're choosing members of who's going to be on the committee, but just one of those people will be the chairperson. So to get us started with this concept, I want to just talk through how we create a logic chain and have us do a practice one, and then we'll dive into an actual game. So when we create a logic chain, we're going to start by making two headers. One is going to be for usually an in column, and one is going to be for an out column. And then we're going to start adding in the elements in the game. And we're typically going to start by adding them kind of from the middle so that we have some room above and below. So let's say we have element A. We're going to put A in the in column and we're going to add it across from itself in the out column. And typically there will be some sort of rule connecting A to another element. So maybe it'll be if A is in, B is out. So we'll draw an arrow connecting those two letters, and then we'll make what's called the contrapositive. So if I know that if A is in, then B is out, the contrapositive is where we reverse and negate those two letters to get a logical relationship that's also true, which is if B is in, then A is out. And that's going to look like this. And I will repeat that until I have used all of the information that I've been given in this series of rules. So in order to do this, we have to have a pretty good grasp of conditional logic itself. So here's the exercise that we're going to do. I've got a series of rules here and sort of a basic in and out chart to get you started. And what I'd like for you to do is first see if you can diagram all of these rules as they are just directly on the in and out chart. And second, if you are looking for something a little more advanced and you feel comfortable with this, see if you can also write the contrapositive for each of these rules and add that to the diagram as well. And as a reminder, the contrapositive is when we take this existing relationship, this existing conditional, and we reverse it and we negate it. And we get sort of a second way of saying the same thing that is equally valid. So I'll leave an example over here. If my original statement is if A is in, then B is in, then it follows logically that if B is out, A has to be out. And that's called the contrapositive. So I'm going to pause for a moment and give you all an opportunity to try this out on pencil and paper. I'll give you about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll go over it together and then dive into an actual game. So let's talk through this together. So I'm going to go through each of these rules and share how we would add it to the diagram, how we would make the contrapositive, and how we would add the contrapositive to the diagram. So starting with if A is in, then B is out. I would start on the left-hand side for A on the in column and draw an arrow to B on the out column. To make the contrapositive, I would reverse and negate that statement. So that would be if B is in, then A is out. And then I would add that to my diagram as well. And what you'll notice often is that when you diagram a rule and it's contrapositive, they sort of crisscross in the same direction like this, particularly if they are rules that cross from the in column to the out column. Let's look at the second rule. If C is out, then D is in. So here we're starting with our if on the outside. So I'm going to start over here where C is out, and I'm going to draw an arrow to D on the in column. My contrapositive, if I reverse and negate, is if D is out, then C is in. So here I will again start on the out column and draw an arrow to C on the in column. Notice the difference between these first two rules. My first rule started with an if relationship that had the first letter on the in column. The first letter is selected. So my line started from the in column and the arrow pointed towards the out column, and so did the contrapositive. On the second rule, the first term in my rule started on the out column. It's not selected. So my line started on the out column and it's pointing in the opposite direction. This third rule actually has a positive relationship. If E is in, then F is in. So in this situation, I'm actually going to come to the in column and I'm going to draw a line on the outside of the column pointing from E to F. The contrapositive would then be if F is out, then E is out. So I'm going to go to the out column. I'm going to start with F is out, and I'm going to draw a line to E is out. And I do that just so that these lines don't interfere or get messy with the lines that are crossing from the in column to the out column. So if a relationship stays on the same side, whether that's just all on the in column or all on the out column, I draw that line around the outside of the column. The next rule gets a bit more complex. It's what we call a compound conditional. If G is in, then H and I are both in. This actually allows me to draw two different lines. So if G is in, then H is going to be in. And if G is in, then I is going to be in. When I make the contrapositive of a compound conditional, I still reverse and negate, but I also swap the ands for ors or the ors for ands. So this is going to become if H or I are out, then G is out. And that's because if G were in, they would both be in. Natalie, you have a question? Okay, you should be able to speak, Natalie. What's your question? We can't hear you right now, no. Okay, no worries. You can raise your hand again when you're ready. Oh, I think I hear you.
Okay, now you can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So sorry, quick question. For the diagram where it says G, then, so if G, then H and I, how come the G connected to the H and the I on the out rather than staying with the G, then H and I in?
Oh, that is a great question. You know why, Natalie? Because I made a mistake. Thank you for calling that.
No, sorry, no problem. I just want to make, cool, thanks.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for drawing that to our attention. Yeah, that absolutely should be here. And that definitely, you know, while that's embarrassing for me, I bet it's, I'm not the only person in the room who's had this happen. It's a thing that happens in logic games, is occasionally with our head in so many different places trying to figure out so many things, we'll diagram something incorrectly. And one of the takeaways from that is that it's so important to have some systems in place for checking your notation. So you might read the rules more than once. I like to read the rules again when I do an orientation question, for example. But really important to have tools in place to check that. Yes, I am going to retype the contrapositive. So the contrapositive here is if H or I are not out, then G, or sorry, if H or I are out, then G will be out. So what that's going to look like is each of these is kind of an independent relationship. So if H is out, that on its own is enough to trigger that G is out. And if I is out, that's enough to trigger that G is out. All right. So our final rule is super complicated. We have another compound conditional. If E, sorry, Suzanne, let me read your. So we have our initial rule is if G is in, then H and I are out. But when we take the contrapositive, we reverse and negate that initial rule. And that creates a relationship where we think about what would happen if H and I, if either one of those were out. Because we know that if G were in, H and I would also be in. If either of those is not present, then G cannot be present. So it is a different but logically valid way of expressing the same relationship as the original rule gives us. And part of what we're practicing here is just how to make those contrapositives, because they kind of supplement the information that we can use for a game. Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Please keep the questions coming. So this final rule is so tricky that I actually wouldn't draw it directly on the diagram. And let me show you why. If I were to try to draw this, I might say like, okay, so if E is in, I draw a line to D on the outside. And if E is in, I draw a line to G on the outside. But this is misleading because they're not both going to be out necessarily. It just says one or the other is going to be out. And I don't have a great way to draw that directly on the diagram. So this type of rule is rare. I won't see it that often on in and out grouping games. But if I am in a situation where I see it, what I might do instead of drawing it is just put a little asterisk next to E and perhaps next to the other letters that are involved in this rule. And then write that rule and its contrapositive off to the side with the asterisk. And I'm just going to have to be extra diligent about checking that rule as I work through the game. So here again, we'll reverse and negate and turn the ands into ors. So if I have D and G in, then that would mean that E is out. And once again, that would be a difficult one for me to diagram. So I'm just going to leave it off to the side with a little asterisk. So this is the basic of an in and out grouping chain. So ultimately, you're going to end up with this series of relationships where letters are connected to each other by arrows. And typically what this allows you to do is to kind of follow the arrows to say, okay, what's going to happen if A is in? Or what's going to happen if D is out? What is this sort of domino series of events that will occur? So to recap, the steps that you want to take are to make an in column and an out column. You want to diagram your if-then rules and their contrapositives and translate them directly onto what we call the logic chain. We're going to get an opportunity now to try this with a real LSAT game. The game that we're going to take a look at is from Prep Text 65. And we're going to start by just working on the diagram itself, and then we'll work through some questions associated with this game. So here it is. It is game 3 from Prep Test 65. And I'm going to give you about 3.5 minutes to work through a setup, and then I'll review the setup with you. All right, good luck. Okay, that is 3.5 minutes. So let's start by talking about how we might recognize the type of game that we're dealing with here. I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson that the first question I always ask myself when I'm looking at a logic game is this asking me to put things into order, to put things into groups, or both? And sometimes it's not possible to tell that immediately from the setup until you start reading all of the rules. So, for example, when I read this initial scenario, it's talking about desserts, main courses, side dishes. I'm getting hungry just reading it. Um, and it's certainly possible that they're going to ask me to figure out what order these different meals are going to be served. But when I start looking through the rules, that's typically when I gain the most clarity on what I'm being asked to do. And in the rules, there is just nothing about the order in which these are going to be served. It's just about what is going to be served and what is not going to be served. So it's a game of selection. And I see that language both in the initial setup and all throughout the rules. I also get a clue that this is going to be an in and out grouping game that will require a logic chain because I see a lot of conditional rules. So I have 3 at the end here that are pretty clear if then rules that would set themselves up nicely for a conditional logic chain. So at this point, I can imagine a basic framework for this game. It's asking me to group, it's asking me to say what is selected and what is not. So I could definitely have an in column and an out column. And they actually tell me specifically that 5 foods are going to be selected. And then there's 8 foods total. So I can deduce that 3 are not going to be selected. But there's a little bit of fancy stuff going on with this game. There are 2 twists that make this game a bit more of an advanced in and out grouping game. The first is that rather than just saying, here are 8 foods, they're all interchangeable, we're going to pick 5 to eat, we have these subgroups. Some of the foods are desserts, some of the foods are main courses, and some of the foods are side dishes. And subgroups are an issue, a twist that can come up in any type of game. They can come up in a number line game. They can come up in a game that has a board for grouping. And we want to make sure that we're prepared to handle subgroups in any type of game that we know how to do. So there's a particular way to handle subgroups for in and out grouping, and it's actually not super complicated at all. Basically, if I've been given subgroups and I know which letters are with which subgroup, then all I have to do is keep track of that on my board. And typically, I'm going to do that by just keeping letters that are in the same group together and using a line or a dash line to indicate their group and labeling it. So I've got desserts, F and G, so I'm just going to put them together at the top. F across from F, G across from G, like we did on the last exercise, and label it as desserts. Then I'm going to do the same for the main courses. Trying to think about what these might be. Noodles, okra, and pasta. Main courses. And then again, I'll draw a line here. And then we have side dishes, T, V, and W. Toast. I don't know if you can come up with a V or a W. Watermelon and vegetables. So what is anyone else having trouble seeing what I'm doing? I see your chat, Suzanne. It should be off to the side of the game. So there's the game, and then I have a diagram over here to the right. Is anyone else having trouble seeing that? Okay, cool. W for wine. I love it, Nikita. Okay, and so these are my side dishes. And then to make things even more complex, in addition to subgroups, we have what we call a special position. And this comes up in the final sentence where we have 3 that are identified as hot foods. So with special positions and in and out grouping, I typically just do something next to those letters to note that they're special. So I'm going to put a star next to the 3 hot foods just so I can keep track of which ones that they are. And then I'm going to get into the rules. So it's pretty common if I have an in and out grouping with a subgroup twist for them to tell me some numerical requirements of how many need to come from each group. So here they say there's going to be basically at least 1 from each group. So I'm going to note that just right next to the group on the side of my logic chain. That also prompts me to think a little bit about what we call numerical distributions, which are an optional way of thinking about certain logic games that many people find helpful. And basically what it means is I say, okay, I've got a certain numerical constraint here. In this case, I know that I need to have exactly 5 in. Where could those 5 come from, given that I have to have at least 1 from each group? So I could see a situation where maybe I have like 3 side dishes, 1 main dish, and 1 dessert, and that would give me 5. It's like appetizer city. Or maybe I'd have a situation where I have 2 desserts, 2 side dishes, and 1 main course, and that would give me 5. Or maybe I could take those same numerical arrangements and I could kind of redistribute them. So maybe it's not 3 sides, maybe it's 3 mains, 1 dessert, and 1 side. But it can be helpful to think in advance just about where these selected dishes are going to come from in terms of subgroups and jot down those numeric distributions. We're also told that at least 1 hot food must be selected. That's a tricky one to put directly on the diagram, so you might just find a way to jot it down. Typically in logic games, in a single logic game section, I'm likely to have at least 1 rule where I'm like, I don't really have a great way to notate this. So all I do for that rule is just write it down in some way that makes sense to me and make sure that I have it in a prominent location. So I know my hot dishes are F, N, and T. So I'm just going to put over here F/N/T, 1 or more is in. And I also have the stars next to those to help me keep track of that. I might circle it or put a box around it. I just really don't want to forget that particular rule. And then we finally get to our more traditional conditional logic rules. The first one is complicated. So I'm going to skip it and focus on the rules that I feel the most confident with and then come back to it. So let's go with if G is selected, O must be selected. So here I'm going to write if G is in, then O is in. And the contrapositive of that is going to be if O is out, then G is out. So I'll draw that on the outside. If O is out, then G is out. We have a rule that's going to cross over here. If N is selected, V is not selected. So if N is in, then V is out. And my contrapositive is going to be if V is in, then N is out. So I'll draw that going in the opposite direction. And then I'm going to come back to this rule and I'm going to go nice and slow because one of the worst things that I can do in a logic game is diagram a rule incorrectly. So it tells me if either P or W is selected, both must be selected. So I can kind of break this down and say like, okay, so what happens if P is selected? Well, that means W is selected. Cool. So I could draw a line from P on the in column to W on the out column. And then what happens if W is selected? Well, that means P is selected. So I could draw that line going in the opposite direction. This is what we call a biconditional, when we have a relationship between 2 letters that goes in both directions. And that means the contrapositive is also going to go in both directions. So I'm going to have if P is out, then W is out. And if W is out, then P is out, because if one is in, the other must be in. So I can draw 2 arrows on the opposite side of the diagram. And there I have it. I've got all my relationships in place on this diagram, and I'm ready to go into the questions. One of the nicest things about these in and out grouping diagrams is that unlike, say, a number line or a grouping board, I don't have to make a lot of inferences before I go into the questions. Once I have a good setup, it's going to treat, my questions really well. I'm very well prepared for those questions just with this. Does anyone have any questions about how we arrived at this diagram? You can raise your hand or put it in the chat. I am going to clear this off in just a minute. So if you would like to, feel free to take a screenshot. You'll see it again. It'll be on some of the slides in a few questions, but it's going to disappear just for a moment. Or you can jot down your version of it. Great question, Suzanne. Do people develop their own methods? Yeah, they do. I typically encourage folks to try a method, whether it's our method or a method from another, test prep organization that clicks with you, to try it first and see if you can make it work well for you, just for the sake of efficiency. That there's a lot of work that's gone into these methods, and there's a reason that we teach them, and it's because they are effective for a variety of people in these games. That said, there's always more than one way to set up a diagram. So if you feel like you've given a particular type of diagram a fair shake, and it's just not clicking with the way that you solve problems, then absolutely think about what might be another approach for a game like this. I will tell you that when I took my LSAT, I didn't really have any formal training in logic games. I think I read a few chapters of a book, and I still was able to do just fine. So there's definitely not only one way to solve this. All right, so let's take this into some questions. Here is your first question. And as I mentioned, the diagram is not going to appear for this one. So you can reference your own notes, and you can also reference the rules, which, hint, hint, should be enough information on their own for you to solve this question. I'll be back in about a minute and a half to ask you for your answers. All right, I am going to launch a poll. And if you're ready, you can choose the answer that you picked to this question in the poll. All right. So one really cool thing about logic games is that the same types of questions appear over and over, no matter what type of game you're dealing with. And oftentimes we can replicate strategies across different games. So this is my favorite question type. It's called an orientation question. And you actually don't need a fancy logic chain diagram in order to solve it. An orientation question is typically the first question after you have read through the rules and set up a game. And it asks you for a complete possible setup of the game. And my favorite approach to this question type is actually to completely ignore the diagram that I just made and go rule by rule. Let me demonstrate what I mean by that. So basically, I have two ways I could think about this. One is I could say, all right, I know that 4 of these answers are going to break some rules. So let me read each answer one at a time and check it against all of the rules. That will work, but it's very time consuming. The other way is to say, I know 4 of these answers are going to break the rules. So let me start with a rule and see which answer breaks it. And that tends to be much more efficient. So if I start with the first rule, I'm looking for each of these to have at least one dessert, F or G, they all do. At least one main course, N, O, or P, they all do. And at least 3 or 1 side dish, T, V, or W, and they all do. Oh, sorry, if you didn't see the poll, no worries. It was just an A through E poll. It pops up if you are using, I think, the Zoom app. But if it didn't pop up for you, that is okay. I trust that you are still participating and will be able to check your own work. So first rule, none of them broke it, so I'll look for the next one. At least one hot food must be selected. I know the hot foods are F, N, and T, so I'm just going to scan to see if I can find one where it's missing one of those letters. Answer choice E doesn't have any of those, so I'd cross it off. If P or W are selected, both must be selected. So I'm looking to eliminate any answer choices that have one of those without the other. D has P but not W. If G is in, O is in, answer choice C violates this. G is in, but O is not in. And if N is in, V must be out. Answer choice A violates this. So by default, answer choice B must be correct. And I don't even need to go back to check it. And again, this is a strategy that works for every game type. And one of my favorite things about it is, I mentioned earlier having a system for checking for errors, which are going to happen in most of us at some point throughout the course of a logic game section. And this is a great way to do it because it forces you to scan the rules multiple times with your eyes after you've already made your diagram. And this is often the place where I'm going to find that I catch a mistake in the way I interpreted a rule or maybe in the way that I wrote it down. Okay, I see a question from Lauren. If O isn't in, G doesn't also have to be incorrect. Yeah, so that's the contrapositive of this rule. So if O is out, then G would be out. That is correct. All right, so let's take a look now at some questions that you might find your diagram beneficial for. I have a version of the diagram up here for y'all to reference, or you can reference the one on your paper. And we're going to try this question number 13. I'll give you about a minute and a half again. I am going to launch a poll. If you do not see it, no worries. You're welcome to chat me your answer. Looks like we've got a pretty wide range of answers out there. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Looks like this is a tough question. So this is an example of what we call an unconditional question, which means we're not really given any new information to go off of. So we have to solve this just using the diagram that we have. And this is sort of a classic unconditional in and out grouping question where they give us a set of pairs of letters and they ask us, which of these basically can't both be out. So the question is, out of this list of pairs, which one is a pair where we have to select at least one? And I translate that into my brain as, okay, so for one of these pairs, I can't have them both out, which means that there is a problem with putting both of them out. So one of the things that can be challenging for questions like this is knowing how to prove or disprove an answer choice, and also just doing all of that work of going through all 5 answer choices. So there are 2 things that I want to do. The first thing that I want to do is kind of triage the answer choices to actively think about which of these is most likely to be the correct answer. And I can use this rephrase of my question to guide me. I'm thinking that if there is a pair of these where at least one of them has to be selected, then there would be a problem with putting them both out. And that probably means there's going to be some action going on with those letters in the out column. They, cause something problematic to happen when they're out. So the first thing that I would do is check out what are the letters that I have in the out column that trigger rules when they're out. And I notice that those letters are O, which would then trigger G to be out, P, which would trigger W to be out, and W, which would trigger P to be out. So immediately my eyes would go to answer choices that have one or more of those letters. So I notice B has O, D has both O and P, and E has W. D looks like it has the most potential for me because it has 2 of the letters that have a lot going on when they're in the out column. So I would start with D. And the way that I'm going to test this answer is actually just to confirm whether it's true that there is a problem with putting both of them out. And I'm going to do that by putting both of them out and seeing what happens. And this is what we call attempting to disprove. If we have a question that asks us for something that must be true, we try to show what happens if it's false. And if that breaks down, if it breaks the game, that's how we know we found our answer. So to do this, I'm going to make a little T-chart, which is a tool that I use a lot when I'm working through a question on an in and out grouping game. I've got the in column on my left side, and I know I'm looking to put 5 there and 3 in my out column. And I'm going to add some little rows just to indicate the dessert, the main course, and the side. I'm not going to label them. I can just reference my chart for that. And I know that in this chart, O and P are both going to be out, and they're both main course hits. So if O and P are out, let me see what else happens. So if O is out, that triggers G to be out. And if P is out, that triggers W to be out. Does anyone see the problem? Tell me in the chat if you see it. Lindsay sees it. Good. Yeah, more than 3 are out. And notice that I wrote the 3 and the 5 at the top. I might not have noticed that too many were out if I hadn't done that, but I do that from experience because this is often a reason to select or eliminate an answer on in and out grouping, is that the out column is going to become too full. So in this case, I can't have both O and P out, which means at least one of them needs to be in, and I have found my correct answer, which is the answer choice D. Let me know if you have any questions. You can raise your hand or put them in the chat. All right. If not, let's try another one. Here it is, and I'll give you a minute and a half again. All right, once again, I'm going to launch a poll. Ooh, looking good on this one. Nice job. So here we have a conditional question, and that same T-chart that we used on the last question can be used once again, but this time we actually kind of get to follow the logic chain. So I'm going to make my 5 and my 3, and my 3 levels. And they tell us that O is the only main course selected. So I'm going to put O here. And that means that both N and P are going to be out. So then I want to follow my logic chain. If N is out, does anything happen? Not really. I know it's one of the hot dishes, so I'll need to select a different hot dish. But when P is out, that tells me that W is out. And that gives me my correct answer, which is answer choice E. Nice work, everybody. Let me know if you have questions there. Good question there. So in general, the more logic games we practice, psychologically, does our speed increase? Is this the pattern recognition idea LSAT teaches us? Yeah, absolutely. So if you're looking to increase your speed on the LSAT, pattern recognition is a big part of that. So part of increasing speed is learning and kind of going deep in different game types so that you get really comfortable with it and it becomes really easy for you to spot, oh yes, this is an in and out grouping game. I've seen a bazillion of these before. Another way to get faster at the LSAT is actually to replay games that you've done before. So for example, you might go home, or you probably already are home, but you might tomorrow at home take this game out again and try it one more time and see if you can set up the logic chain a little bit faster. That repetition helps to build what we call automaticity, which means that these moves that you need to make in your mind start happening faster. And because there are patterns on the LSAT, they also transfer to other games. And I think that's a good place for us to move into the last couple of things that I wanted to share with y'all, which just have to do with how to move forward. So to recap what we've learned in this lesson, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. I just want you to think about it, see if you can answer this. Would you be able to tell me how do you know to use a logic game? What you should add after you diagram a rule? Oops, sorry, got ahead of myself there. And how to handle subgroups. As a reminder, how to use a logic chain is when you have the in and out groups, so a selection game or 2 groups and mostly conditional rules. After you diagram a rule, you should always add the contrapositive if it's a conditional rule on this type of game. And for subgroups, we just want to draw them kind of together with a line separating each of them. So if you're thinking about what to do for continued practice, getting good at these in and out grouping games definitely means you want to be strong in conditional logic, and that also pays dividends on other games and even other sections of the LSAT. The 5-pound book from Manhattan Prep is a great tool for practicing conditional logic in depth. You want to practice recognizing in and out grouping games. One of the best ways to do that is to just expose yourself to a lot of different games and do drills where you go through each different game, you read it, and you ask yourself, okay, what type of diagram would I set up for this game? And then you can go to our forums, which have free explanations for pretty much every game that's ever been published by the LSAC, and you can use that to check if you came up with the right diagram. And then finally, you want to master the question level techniques. As I mentioned, as we were going through this game, there are a ton of patterns in terms of the types of questions that you'll see, both within and across games. And again, our form is a great resource for you to get more information about those as you practice. So here's our website one more time if you're interested in checking out our upcoming classes. Thank you all so much for being a great group. I'll stick around to answer the last couple questions in the chat. But if it's time for you to go, it was nice to meet you and best of luck with your LSAT. So question from Lindsay, do you recommend diagramming the full list of elements in both in and out columns and their rules in this way on the LSAT? Yes, I wouldn't do like a separate diagram for the rules, but I would do the in and out columns for this particular type of game. The recording of the session will actually be available on YouTube, Jalen. It takes, I think, a couple weeks to process, but then it'll be up. Kayla, yes, you actually have 5 pieces of scratch paper to use, although you do have to provide them yourself, but you're allowed to use 5 pieces of scratch paper. And I saw a hand up as well. Catherine, let me give you permission to talk. What's up?
I just wanted to say, I heard someone say that their test date was on November 14th at the beginning, I think. I sent this message to you, Allie, but I realized I didn't send it to everybody else.
Okay.
I had a moment earlier today when I realized that I thought my test date was November 14th because the website had showed me that it was, but then when I looked back today, it wasn't. And so I called LSAC and it turned out that November 14th isn't actually a test date in November. So just wanted to say, if you think that that's what your test date is, definitely double check to make sure, because it's actually, the actual test dates are earlier than that.
Super helpful. Thank you. All right. With that, I am going to head out. Best of luck, everybody.